Hello, I'm Frances Ford, the artistic director of the War Plays Project. This project was started to use spoken word theater, poetry, in this case, interviews, to start conversation about the effects of war, to start conversations in coffee houses or classrooms or wherever we can reach people thinking of taking up military service. What you're going to see today is VetSpeak, a collection of interviews with military men and conscientious objectors from several of the United States wars. You're going to hear a variety of views, and we hope they'll help you to start conversations, to think about possible military service or perhaps possibly not serving. Thank you for taking time to watch. You may recognize Don Olsen's voice from the radio, KFAI. He has a program, Northern Sun Radio News. And I'm very happy to welcome him to VetSpeak. Don, when the Vietnam War started, you were sort of thinking you might get employment and be in it. Can you explain what your feelings about the war were at the beginning?
Well, even though I was an international relations student, my professors didn't know much about it at the University of Minnesota when I started in 1961. There was a draft, and I assumed I might have to go into the military, so I was in ROTC, Air Force. Because because it was the cleanest branch, or the least messy. But I didn't like it very much, and I did drop out of it. So I went along there for several years in my international relations and looking for perhaps government employment. As it started to heat up in 64, 65, and as the Lyndon Johnson increased the number of troops that were being sent there, it got to be more and more of an issue. So then I was in graduate school, and then I started gradually being drawn into the anti-war movement. I knew about these things that were going on, and they were having these discussions and arguments, and I didn't pay too much attention. I had this idea that I could help countries of the world. I was into the international aspects of it, and so I was thought that's the way you could help people. I formed this group called Conservative and Liberal Americans Against the War in Vietnam. We would have graduate students and people that wanted to show their opposition to the war, but still keep their patriotism. That's why it's Conservative and Liberal Americans, as opposed to some of these more radical groups that were out there in the Minnesota Committee to End the War in Vietnam. Then by the spring of 1967, I got another interview in Washington with the Agency for International Development. And I would have gone to Vietnam to do who knows what. Yeah. And so I used this trip to Washington, paid flight, to also go to this huge anti-war march. It was quite a moving sight with all these people there. And so I kind of gave up my career aspirations. I thought, I'm going to change my ideas. I'm going to cast my lot more with the anti-war movement. I went on this march, and this had a big impact. I mean, that's why I always say it's good for people to get out in the streets and march. It overcomes some of your inhibitions about doing things with your life or doing the right thing. We set up a draft information center to counsel people because people weren't getting the help they were needed through the draft board. And then also is developing the strategy of the resistance, that people were going to turn in their draft cards. They were going to non-cooperate with selective service, and we're going to try and clog the system non-violently so that would grind to a halt. In the Twin Cities, we were eventually counseling 100 guys a week.
Wow.
Every day somebody was refusing induction. Every day we would go down there at 6 a.m. and we would be leafleting people who are going into the military, saying, well, if you don't want to go, we'll help you. If you do go in, don't let them push you around. I had my student deferment, and the first National Draft Card Day turn-in the fall of 1967, I was too afraid to do it. I didn't want to directly go to jail, or what I thought would be happening. By the third National Draft Card turn-in, I did turn them in. I was strong. I knew why I was going to do it. My draft board had offered me a conscientious objector because I was one, but I didn't take it. I decided then that the nonviolent way to change this government was to confront the war machine with my body. But I was prosecuted for a little action I was involved later. In July 10th, 1970, there was 8 of us who were arrested in draft boards around.
Is this the Minnesota 8?
This is the Minnesota 8. There had been these draft boards raids going on that led by these radical pacifist clergy, namely the Berrigan brothers, who were priests. And I had been asked maybe if I wanted to be one. Oh, there again, I was too afraid to do it. That spring of 1970, we had the big student strike after the invasion of Cambodia. Here, the war is expanding again. We've already been into Laos. Now we're going into Cambodia. This is after the students were shot down in Kent State, and then they're in Jackson State. Students were shot there and killed. So as the student strike wound down, there's a bunch of us started casing out draft boards throughout greater Minnesota. On the night of January 10th, we took how many people we had.
Was this January 10th, 1970?
1970, and we went into, we had 5 draft boards we were going to do. One was successful at Wabasha, Minnesota. All the files are destroyed. People came up to me for years afterwards and told me how they got out of the draft because of that. And then, lo and behold, the FBI was waiting for us. We know that they were waiting in many other locations too. Sons and daughters of sheriffs, they were keeping watch in various places. So somehow they had word, but we became known as the Minnesota 8. So we were initially charged with attempted sabotage of national defense materials.
It's pretty serious.
It was very serious, 10 years maximum. Eventually had these celebrated trials. The first 2 we couldn't do very much, that I was partly in. And the third trial was very interesting because Judge Neville allowed in testimony the whole anti-war case about why the war was wrong.
So did you end up going to prison?
I did. And so I spent my 20 months on a 5-year sentence. We all got out on a special parole. I was in the U.S. Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. And I continue to do draft and military counseling, so I'm still realize that we have a lot of changes to do and that things ebb and flow, and so you just got to ride it out and have the long-term viewpoint and continue to hold to your principles.
Ron, thank you so much for coming and sharing your experiences. You were in Vietnam. What years were you in Vietnam?
I was in Vietnam in 1968 and 1969, and I went in and joined the service right out of high school. I grew up in a military family, so...
Oh, you did?
So I was, my father was a pilot in the Air Force, so we traveled around all over 6 different states, and so the military was kind of in our, in our blood. And another reason why I wanted to join the service was a friend of mine who was in high school with me, joined the Army year after he got out, and was killed over there. And that kind of brought the war home to my neighborhood and made it more personal. And another reason that I wanted to go was because I thought, by going to war, you become a man, and those kind of things that many 18, 19-year-old, 17-year-old kids start to think about.
You described to me, after all your training in the Army Airborne, the 82nd, what it was like when you got off the commercial flight to Vietnam.
Unlike the war now in Iraq, where people go over as a unit, especially the Guard, and they go over as a group, and they've been together, they train together. In Vietnam, in the Army, everybody went over individually, so you flew a commercial Northwest airline, at least I did, to Vietnam from the United States. And I remember this so clearly, is that when the plane landed in Vietnam, and I kind of looked out the window because I had no idea what's going to happen. I didn't know if they were going to, as soon as I got off the plane, someone would give me a rifle and I'd run into the jungle. I mean, nobody knew. But when the door opened to the plane, the stewardess opened the plane, this hot, humid air just rushed through, and everybody had this look on their face like, what in the hell are we getting ourselves into? It was just, and the stewardess said, welcome to Vietnam, and there was a lot of emotion in her face because I think she realized that a lot of us that were getting off this plane might not be getting back on in a year when their tour was over. I asked this one guy who had returned, and he said, he just gave me he said, there's only 2 things you need to know. He says, one, that no matter what you think war is like, it's completely different than you can imagine it to be. And the other thing that he said was that you're going to see a lot of people walking around that you think should be locked up. And sure enough, when I did get to Vietnam, it was all true. Wow. No matter what you think war is like, it's completely different. And I did see a lot of people that I thought should be locked up. That's why I was in light weapons, and I had volunteered to be assistant machine gunner. One day when we were on patrol, we came across this in the mountains, this NVA soldier that had been had been killed by the Americans and was just there rotting. His body was rotting, and that was the first really taste of seeing someone who had been killed in action. And then shortly after that, we were in a village along the coast, and we came under sniper fire and ambushed, and that was when the war really started to hit home, that I could get killed, and several people got wounded. I'd been in Vietnam maybe 7 months, and I was a squad leader with 7 individuals, and we had a new platoon sergeant who had just come in country, and he was kind of gung-ho, and he came to my little tent, was in the jungle, and said, let's go up and kill some gooks today. And most everybody that was in our platoon, was looking out for themselves and for their buddies to make sure that they got home, and get into a lot of conflict. Contact with the enemy was something that, you know, we didn't look forward or want to do unless it came about without us knowing about it. So anyway, we went on this patrol, and as we were coming over this hill, we saw this patrol of Viet Cong, and they had another Vietnamese person with their hands tied behind their back, leading, you know, with a gun to his back, and we started firing at them, and they immediately ran into the jungle on this trail that went through this little village, and we started running after them, and then most of us realized that, okay, we could be setting ourselves up to get ambushed ourselves by just charging off. But this platoon sergeant we had, who was just in country, just wanted to charge anyway, and he kept going. And as we entered the village, there was this young, a small hut, and this family came out. Mom and Pop, and then a young girl, maybe 9 or 10 years old, and they stood in front of their house to show us that, you know, there wasn't anything that they were hiding, and they were innocent and didn't want any trouble. And next to their hut, about maybe 10, 15 yards away, was this huge clump of bamboo. It was really thick, and someone could easily hide in there. And one of the squad members said, should we shoot up the bamboo in there, and just to make sure that there's no one there? So I gave the order to fire, and we fired it up, and somehow one of the rounds from someone's weapon ricocheted and hit this little girl right in the chest. And you know, and she was still alive, so we cut down a bamboo pole and put her in a hammock, and we got the platoon sergeant to come back, who was kind of reluctant. He wanted to keep pressing on, and I said we had a wounded civilian that we needed to get back to our camp. And so he reluctantly, you know, we all went back, and as the helicopter landed and the mother and the father got on the helicopter, I looked at her one more time in this girl's eyes, and, you know, I just, you know, never forget that. And it's something that has stuck with me for years, you know, for the 30 years that the war, I've been away from the war, and I don't know if that girl lived or died or whatever happened. That kind of started changing my attitude about the war. I mean, I was pretty gung-ho when I went over, believing that we were there to stop the communists, but a lot of the things that our country was doing wasn't winning the hearts and minds of the people. On the news today, the news report that was just recently brought up about the Marines who massacred those civilians, women and children, those kind of things were happening in Vietnam. Those kind of things happened in World War II. Those kind of things happened in Korea. It's all part of what war is and what it does to people, and it's just what happens. I wanted to forget about the war and start a family, and it took me a long time. I think when my son, you know, was in his teens, I realized that, you know, the war started in Nicaragua, you know, with Nicaragua, the Contras, and I started to realize that, you know, my son could be in this, and I don't want him to be in this. So I started to rehash those old feelings about the war, and I finally started to write about my feelings. I wrote a page or two, you know, I just bawled and bawled and bawled. And then I met some people that wanted to start a vets group in Minneapolis, and what we came to realize was we didn't want the kids growing up in high school, junior high, college, to go to war and not know what the realities of war is.
I'm here today with Jim Lovestower, a member of the Marine Corps. And when did you serve, Jim?
From 1968 through 71.
And you were in the Vietnam War, but you weren't in...
I was eager to go to Vietnam because my dad had been in the Marine Corps in World War II. And he had been in combat, and I wanted to show that I was as good a man as he was. However, during that time, they needed clerks more than they needed riflemen, so they made me a clerk. And I served in California during the whole time I was in the Marine Corps.
During that time, as an 18-year-old who'd been in about 6 months, you were given a very special duty.
Yep, I'd been in about 8 months at that time, and I was 18. And I was told that I would be escorting the body of a dead Marine back to his family. Now, the base where I was stationed had a unit whose job it was to do that. They were called escort platoon. In June of 1969, there were so many Marines being killed in Vietnam that escort platoon, all of the men were out doing their job. And so as the bodies kept piling up, they came to our unit and took me and 2 other men to do body escort. I was told, you stay with this body from the minute it's put on the airplane to the minute it's put in the ground. And at no time will you leave this body unless it's in the care of someone at the funeral home. On the way to the airport, the man who was driving, who worked in the morgue, told me that it was a half-open casket because the young Marine had been torn to pieces by a mortar round in Vietnam. He said that indeed there was no rib cage left, that he was in uniform, and that underneath the uniform was a plastic shell that made it look like there was a body there. Now I could see that his hands were wrapped in gauze because they'd been shredded by the mortar round too. Here's where his story and my story intersect. When he was in high school, he was an all-conference football player. He was a big guy, 6'4" and 220 pounds, and he was senior class president, and he married his high school sweetheart. And when I was in high school, I was one of the most unpopular guys in my class. I was considered a dork by everybody. So, and here's the other dream that he got to live that I wanted, and that was he got to go to Vietnam. And he came back in a bag. The minister said he died for his country. And I thought, there's something bogus about that. And the minister said he gave his life for his country. And I've since come to realize that none of these men who have been killed in combat give their lives for their country. They have their lives ripped away from them. And they come back dead.
This flag you're holding, does that have any relationship to the story of the empty Marine?
Yeah. I was one of the pallbearers, carried the body out to the hearse. We took it to a cemetery, laid it up on the rack, and during the entire ceremony, there was a flag draped over the coffin. After the ceremony at the cemetery was over, along with another Marine who'd come from a local base, I picked up the flag and folded it to look exactly like this one. And then I walked over and I presented it to the 17-year-old widow.
I understand you applied several times to get to Vietnam.
I requested a transfer many times to go to Vietnam, and finally my sergeant said, what you're doing, you're a typist, you're way more valuable to us as a typist than as a rifleman. We can find riflemen by the thousands. It takes a lot of energy to train a man to be a typist, to run a typewriter and work in an office. The last year and a half that I was in, I was stationed on an Air Force base with a small unit called Marine Liaison. And our job was to send men to Vietnam and process them when they came back. And what I saw when a man was coming back from Vietnam after 13 months of what they call in-country was something that, that they called the 1,000-yard stare. It took me a while to catch on to it. These men, their eyes were set back in their heads. They were gaunt, many of them. They were tan, very deeply tan from being out in the bush. And when they'd look as if they were seeing something off in the distance. And I've since been told by men who were in combat that they were seeing some pretty horrible things. We like to think, because we're the wealthiest country on earth, that we provide everything our military men and women need when they're in the field.
Yes, I always assume that.
Of course. I recently read an interview with a young man who'd been in Iraq in the Marines, and he was telling his father that they were fed once or twice a day. And they were in combat, and they were expected to get by on 1 or 2 meals. And this is 2004 when he was in Iraq.
Oh my God.
In Vietnam, the same thing was true for some units. And of course, we might think, well, they've been neglecting our men. It's more complicated than that. To resupply a unit that's under fire means coming under fire yourself. And sometimes when you're in combat, you go hungry. Sometimes when you're out on patrols, you go hungry. And a lot of those young men did. And I could tell when they came back, they looked hungry.
At some point, something changed, and you became angry and started speaking out against war. What was that point, Jim?
Well, you know, in 1983, I was living in Minneapolis here, and it was October of 1983. I'd been out working in the garden, and I came in the house and the radio was on, and the man on the radio said, "And today in Beirut, Lebanon," he said, "Today in Beirut, Lebanon, before sunrise, 241 Marines were killed. As they slept, they were killed by a truck bomb." And it took me several weeks before I would listen to the radio again. And as I processed that, I realized that I had to say something about my truth about being in the Marine Corps. Now, I'd gotten out in 1971.
And this is 83. The radio program was 83.
And I'd hardly said a word to anybody about my time in the Marine Corps, even though I'd never been in combat. Now, this is typical for veterans. Veterans, like anyone else, want to be loved and accepted. And especially combat veterans who have seen the horrors they've seen are afraid that if they tell the truth, that they'll be rejected by other people, because the truth is often contrary to what our government tells us about war. Our government tells us romantic pictures about being heroes and jumping out of airplanes and killing the enemy and defending our country. There were no Marines defending our country in Vietnam. They were defending each other. They were defending themselves. A friend of mine told me just yesterday about a man who he knew was a Marine officer in Vietnam. And he said to his men when he got there, "My job is to get you back alive. Your job is to keep me alive so I can get you back alive." And he was one of the few officers during that time in Vietnam who was never threatened. You may know in Vietnam, especially in the 1970s, there was a phenomenon called fragging, where officers who were either stupid or autocratic or just incompetent would have a hand grenade, a fragmentation grenade, that's why it's called fragging, thrown into their bunk at night. And for the first time in the history of this country, men were killing their own officers. We think that nobody can understand, and so we keep our mouths shut. We're afraid to tell the truth. I'm still sometimes afraid to tell the truth, and I know that I have to do it anyway. You see, when I was 18 and joining the Marine Corps, I took an oath, Frances.
And the oath was?
Part of that oath was a promise to defend my country from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And anybody who lies about the role of the military in our country is an enemy to my country. And I am here to speak the truth.
Jack, what years were you in Panama?
I was in Panama from 1971 to 1973, an 18-month tour of duty. I was actually resistant to war and to the military at the time that I went into the service. I had taken part in some of the major demonstrations that took place in the Twin Cities area prior to being drafted.
Ah, it was a draft.
Yes.
And they were taking everyone, college and everyone?
Richard Nixon had decided to get even with the college students, and so he did away with all graduate deferments, and they reaped a harvest of college graduates in the first lottery draft in 1971. There's a whole lot of bases in the canal zone, and that was just my tour of duty, was base duty in the canal zone.
Oh, this is the base you described. You have movie theaters and beaches and...
Oh, yeah, it was the luxury life, the restaurants, the food. I mean, it was just a wonderful place to be. I heard that the generals and colonels and majors rated that as the top, vacation duty in the world in Panama. Had yachts.
So how come you didn't fall in love with war at this point? I mean, it sounds like you had it pretty good. You still were...
Well, I just, the United States military is about slaughter, and it's about slaughtering people. It's about killing them, most often civilians as much as anybody else, and I didn't want to be a part of any of that. There was a psychiatrist or psychologist named B.F. Skinner who wrote a book called Beyond Dignity and Freedom, and he used to train pigeons. And so they took this sort of training and adapted it to training young kids from wherever to become killers, to desensitize them to violence, and then to redirect their response to dangerous situations. Yeah, I just was totally culturally separated from what I had left 2 years earlier, totally, completely separated. I had expected to come back and join the resistance to the Vietnam War in 1973 because when I left in 71, the University of Minnesota, at least parts of it, was on strike because of the war and the shootings in Kent State. So, I mean, there were thousands upon thousands of people resisting the war, and I came back expecting to join back into that, and there was nothing left, zero. And it was still about two more years till the Vietnam War was actually over. I started university. It didn't work out because I had moved into a place where the people weren't dedicated to studying in school. They were having, they were just having a regular lifestyle, which, I was in the engineering school and I could not be in a place where somebody's having a regular lifestyle. It was just because the work was just prodigious that you had to do, and you couldn't get behind. So I realized that I couldn't do that, and I found kind of a low-level manufacturing job in a nut and bolt factory for a while. And then I thought I kept looking for work in other places, and I didn't realize I was in the worst recession since the Great Depression, which was the post-Vietnam War. I was probably more angry than I should have been, and so people didn't like to be around me at all, and that included my family. And I think there was a general sense that people really didn't like people from the military either. I mean, so the class of people that I came from. And I didn't, I saw one or two other veterans, but there were virtually no other veterans around. I suppose they all faded into the woodwork like I did.
I want to go to the story about Pat Doyle.
This was, one of those experiences that really sort of changed your life. I was 15 or 16 years old, and it was a beautiful day, just like it is outside today. The sun's shining, it's warm, hundreds and hundreds of people at the beach. And I was just sitting at a table, and I don't know, I don't remember how I ended up sitting up at the table with Pat Doyle, but he was, I'm not sure if he was drafted or he had enlisted under the threat of being drafted, but I remember he had finished his initial training and he had gotten his orders for Vietnam. And so he sort of said to me, he said, I'm not coming back, that I'm going to die over in Vietnam. And, it was really, really a moving moment for me.
Did he come back?
He died in Vietnam a few months later. So. There used to be zero. There was none whatsoever for the Vietnam people until the vet centers started up. It's interesting. I have a friend of mine who is finally, just now, he's my age, in his 50s, maybe 60, receiving his disability pay, his total disability pay. He was getting partial disability, but so you can see how long some of this stuff stretches out. But even post-traumatic stress syndrome wasn't even recognized in those days, So you had this whole culture of people that were just, you walk away from the military and it's over. I graduated college with a degree in chemistry in 1971, and I went back to university, took a lot of courses. I eventually graduated again in chemical engineering, and I think it's 1983 or 84. I don't remember. But anyways, there was a total of 17 years until I got a reasonable job. And I put that tax, I call that a tax because I had to pay, somebody got money. And so when I estimate that tax, it was a $500,000 tax to go into the service. What it has done for me is that I really just continually try to resist what I consider to be an institution devoted to destruction, to death, to killing.
And you're still doing that today.
And I do that till this day, yeah. So at least that's the good part of it.
I enlisted in 1980, May 6th of 1980.
You remember the exact date?
Yeah.
Well, why did you enlist? Were you in college? Were you working? What was the story? Why did you enlist?
Well, joining the military was never in my future, in my head, in my plans. My plans were to be a photographer for National Geographic. I mean, that was my goal. And by that time, I was 22 years old, and I was already an award-winning photographer. But I didn't know what else to do with it. I didn't know how to take the next step. I wasn't school trained, and I had no business savvy, so I didn't understand about marketing and advertising, and all I knew is it cost money. I didn't have the money. I don't know, the way that it was presented is just like it's presented to so many people today, that it's an opportunity that you get money for college, you get medical, dental, you get an opportunity to travel around the world, you get job training.
I'd take a job like that.
Wouldn't that be cool?
Yeah.
You get retirement, you know. The big thing that they kind of tend to leave out is, and they assume that young people understand this, is that the basic primary mission of the military is teaching people how to kill, how to destroy, and how to win war, all means available. After high school, it's all economic. Whatever you do to support yourself, to support your life, it's all economic. And when I was in basic training, and I got to know some of the women, now I was 22, I would say the average age was 22 years old.
Okay.
And we had at least 5 women that were in their 30s, early 30s.
In basic?
In basic training. And they were in the military because they were trying to find a way out of their hardship. When I got to the induction center, photography was closed. And
really?
Yeah, and at this point I had already pretty much walked around in my bra and underwear and been measured and examined and prodded and poked and put before everyone. And you're sitting at this table, and all of a sudden you're surrounded by all these men of authority. And I'm thinking, you know, deeply inside, oh my God. There was such an essence of being trapped. And wow. There was also a sense that I didn't want to let my parents down. I didn't want them to be, I wasn't a coward. And they went and got this big book, and they said, well, your scores were really strong around communications. So they plopped this big book down, and they said, well, take a look through the jobs and let us know what you think that you would be more inclined to do, which I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah. Because
really, you're going to learn better if you're going into a career that you really want to learn how to do. And I picked air traffic control. For basic training is homophobia, misogyny, domination, power over, intimidation, anything that they can do to instill fear so that you are going to do everything possible to prove to them, to your supervisors and your superiors, that you are not a coward, you're not a sissy, you're not a faggot, you're not a homosexual.
You were a real, faithful soldier in the military, and yet today you speak very strongly against it.
I was a star player. I got a lot of awards and recognition for my work. I think it was because all of that really cracked in the Middle East. I saw what really happens, and it wasn't per regulation, it wasn't per the spit and shine image. It was all smoke and mirrors. You know, we had we had scud alarms 2 to 3 times a night. We worked 12-hour shifts. It's just a accumulation of all the information that comes back from the pilots, from the people that we knew who loaded bombs. So we learned about what type of bombing we were doing. We just obliterated the country. We used camels for target practice. And I got a chance to see people turn mean. And I didn't want to be that way. I didn't want to turn like that. I got a taste enough. I had Calvin and Hobbes and Bloom County comic books that I took with me. And in order to keep myself focused, but I drew these cartoons, and what happened was these cartoons that I drew and my tent mates went through the books and picked out were a perfect depiction of the emotional roller coaster ride of our emotions through the whole process. I kept a journal while I was overseas, and when I came home, in my evenings after duty, I would sit there for 2 to 3 hours and read through my journal and add any extras. Although there was still a lot of it that I left out. The incidences of sexual assault, being hunted basically, and those women that were raped. I didn't talk about that. And then I never, of course, talked about my own incident of being on a C-135, KC-135, for over a 12-hour trip in which most of the men, I was the only woman on board, where most of the men who had been in the Gulf were wanting to have sex. I mean, that's part of the myth. We fought for our country.
I'm just going to go back.
I was in the bowels of an institution that its main export was death and destruction of the very planet that I had wanted to photograph.